They said people like me should stay invisible, Maya Johnson would remember years later. But rain has a strange way of washing lies off the glass. The night it happened, the rain came down in long silver sheets against the polished windows of Castellano Holdings, turning the towering Manhattan office building into a glowing fortress of light and reflections. Inside, the marble lobby shone under warm chandeliers, the kind that cost more than Maya made in an entire year. Outside, the sidewalks were slick and shining, the city humming with late evening traffic and the distant echo of subway brakes grinding beneath the streets. Maya Johnson stood just inside the revolving glass doors in her gray, cleaning uniform, clutching a small canvas bag that held everything she brought with her to work each night. A pair of worn gloves, a notepad, and a cheap pen she used to write reminders to herself while she cleaned conference rooms that belonged to people who never noticed her existence. She had worked the night shift at Castellano Holdings for 3 months, quietly emptying trash bins and wiping fingerprints from glass tables while executives discussed deals worth more than she could imagine. The rule was simple and unspoken. Cleaners were meant to move like shadows. They came after the meetings ended, after the decisions were made, after the people with real authority left the building. But tonight Maya had made a mistake. She had spoken. It happened in the 32nd floor conference room, where the company's senior managers had been gathered around a polished walnut table, their voices confident as they finalized a strategy that Maya recognized instantly as dangerously flawed. She hadn't meant to interrupt. She had simply paused with a cleaning cloth in her hand and said, quietly but clearly, "Excuse me, sir, but that expansion plan might collapse your Midwest division within a year." For a moment the room had gone completely still. Then someone laughed. Daniel Price, the operations director with the perfectly pressed suit and the sharp voice, turned slowly in his chair and stared at her as if he had just discovered that a piece of furniture had started talking. "Did the janitor just give me business advice?" he asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. A few of the men around the table chuckled, exchanging amused looks as if Maya had delivered the evening's entertainment. She felt her cheeks warm but kept her voice steady. "I studied corporate finance in college," she said softly. "Your supplier projections don't account for the shipping bottleneck in Chicago." Daniel's smile widened, but it was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "That's adorable," he said. "Security." The word echoed across the conference room like a door slamming shut. 2 guards appeared within seconds, their footsteps firm against the marble floor as they guided Maya toward the elevators despite her quiet attempts to explain. By the time the elevator doors opened into the lobby, the rain had begun outside, streaking the tall glass windows in restless patterns. The guards escorted her through the revolving door without a word, and suddenly the warmth of the lobby vanished behind her as the cold rain soaked through her uniform in seconds. The heavy glass doors closed with a soft mechanical click. Behind them, the building glowed with the quiet comfort of power and success. Maya stood on the sidewalk under the harsh yellow streetlight, water dripping from her sleeves as taxis rushed past in the wet street. High above her, 30 floors up, someone stood near a window watching the scene unfold in silence. And at that moment, none of them, not Daniel Price, not the guards, not even the quiet man behind the glass, had any idea that the woman standing alone in the rain would one day walk back through those same doors as the owner of everything inside. The rain continued long after the glass doors of Castellano Holdings closed behind her, falling steadily over Manhattan like the city itself was trying to wash the night away. Maya Johnson walked 3 blocks before she finally stopped beneath the narrow metal awning of a small convenience store, water dripping from the ends of her braids and pooling around her worn sneakers. The neon lights from the storefront reflected across the wet sidewalk, turning the street into a river of shifting color while late evening traffic rolled past in slow streams of headlights. She could still hear the laughter from the conference room echoing faintly in her mind, the sound sharp and dismissive, as if the idea that a cleaner could understand business strategy was a joke that deserved applause. Maya pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself and looked down at the small canvas bag still clutched in her hand. Inside were the same simple things she carried every night: a pen, a folded notebook, and a worn student identification card from a university she had not stepped inside for almost 4 years. The card read Columbia Business School, The photograph showing a younger version of Maya, standing with cautious confidence beneath the campus archway. She had been 23 when she started the program, one of the youngest students in her class, and one of the few who could analyze a balance sheet faster than most of the graduate assistants. Her professors used to say that she had an instinct for business the way some musicians had an instinct for rhythm. Maya did not talk much during lectures, but when she did speak, people listened. Then everything changed in a single winter. Her mother was diagnosed with a severe illness that required treatments Maya could never afford on a student budget. Medical bills in the United States have a way of moving faster than ambition, and within months Maya faced a choice that felt less like a decision and more like gravity. She withdrew from the program quietly, sold most of her textbooks, and took whatever job she could find across the city. Waiting tables, cleaning offices, working overnight shifts while the rest of Manhattan slept. Castellano Holdings had been the most stable job she could secure, even if it meant becoming invisible again. For 3 months, she walked the quiet hallways after midnight, listening to the distant hum of the heating system while she wiped fingerprints from glass tables where executives made decisions about millions of dollars. Sometimes she paused long enough to glance at a presentation slide or a spreadsheet left glowing on a laptop screen. Numbers spoke a language she understood immediately. Patterns revealed themselves to her the way constellations appear when someone knows where to look. The expansion plan she saw that evening had not been complicated to analyze. In fact, the mistake had been obvious. A supply chain assumption that ignored seasonal freight delays through Chicago and Milwaukee, a miscalculation that could ripple through the entire Midwest distribution network. Maya had tried to remain silent. She truly had. But something inside her refused to watch a preventable disaster unfold simply because she wore a cleaning uniform. Now the rain soaked deeper into her clothes as she stepped away from the awning and continued walking down the block. Behind her, 40 stories of illuminated glass stretched into the cloudy sky, the headquarters of a company that would never remember the woman who tried to warn them. But high above the street, inside a quiet office lined with dark wood and city views, William Castellano still stood near the window, his gaze fixed on the wet sidewalk below where Maya Johnson had disappeared into the Manhattan night. Morning arrived in Manhattan with the pale gray light that followed a long night of rain, the sidewalks still damp, and the air carrying the faint smell of wet concrete and early coffee from the corner cafes opening their doors. Inside Castellano Holdings, the 32nd floor conference room looked exactly the same as it had the night before. The polished walnut table gleamed under the recessed lights, presentation screens glowed softly against the walls, and a stack of printed reports waited neatly beside a silver carafe of fresh coffee. Daniel Price walked in just after 8:30 in the morning with the confident stride of a man who believed the building existed for his convenience. He loosened his tie slightly and dropped a folder onto the table while the other executives filtered in one by one, their voices low and relaxed as they discussed the next phase of the company's ambitious expansion across the Midwest. No one mentioned the cleaner who had been escorted out the previous night. To them it had been a moment barely worth remembering, a brief interruption in a schedule full of far more important decisions. Daniel connected his laptop to the presentation screen and resumed the discussion exactly where it had ended. Charts filled the display, projections of distribution centers, projected growth curves, transportation routes cutting across the map from Illinois through Wisconsin and into Minnesota. The plan looked elegant on paper, the kind of strategy that made investors nod approvingly during quarterly calls. Daniel tapped the screen with a laser pointer and spoke with polished certainty about freight volumes and supplier timelines, completely confident that the numbers in front of him would lead the company into its next era of expansion. But as the meeting continued, one quiet detail shifted the mood in the room. The door opened, and a tall man stepped inside without announcement. Conversations faded immediately as several executives straightened in their chairs. William Castellano rarely attended operational meetings this early in the morning, and when he did, the room tended to become very still. He moved calmly toward the end of the table, his presence composed and measured, dark suit perfectly pressed against the backdrop of the city skyline stretching beyond the windows. For a moment, he simply observed the screen where Daniel's projections continued scrolling through spreadsheets and maps. William listened without interruption while the discussion carried on, his expression thoughtful, but unreadable. When Daniel finally paused and asked if there were any questions, the room remained silent for several seconds. Then William spoke in a tone so calm it forced everyone to listen carefully. He asked one simple question about the projected shipping capacity through Chicago during the winter freight season. Daniel answered quickly, confident that the schedule had been modeled with sufficient flexibility. William nodded slightly, but his gaze lingered on the chart longer than expected. He asked another question, this time about the backlog risk during severe weather delays and the cost of rerouting shipments if distribution trucks were forced to wait outside the city for extended periods. The executives exchanged subtle glances around the table. The scenario had not been discussed in detail because the plan assumed normal freight conditions across the region. William leaned back in his chair and folded his hands while the numbers on the screen continued to glow against the quiet room. A faint memory surfaced in his mind of a rain-soaked sidewalk and a young woman speaking carefully while holding a cleaning cloth in her hand. "Excuse me, sir, but that expansion plan might collapse your Midwest division within a year." The words had been soft but precise, spoken by someone who clearly understood the mathematics behind the strategy. William Castellano looked again at the projections on the screen, and for the first time that morning the confident rhythm of the meeting began to slow. The conference room remained quiet after William Castellano asked his second question, the kind of silence that spreads slowly when confidence begins to crack. Daniel Price cleared his throat and adjusted the cuff of his shirt before responding again, this time with slightly less certainty than before. He explained that the company had factored in standard winter delays and that the logistics partners had assured them that freight movement through Chicago remained reliable for most of the year. As he spoke, he clicked through several additional slides showing optimistic growth projections, warehouse capacity increases, and projected quarterly revenue that stretched confidently upward across the graph on the screen. Around the table, several executives nodded along, eager for the meeting to continue with its familiar rhythm. But William Castellano did not look convinced. He leaned forward slightly and studied the numbers with the patient focus of someone who had built his reputation on noticing details others overlooked. His voice remained calm when he spoke again, but there was a weight behind his words that shifted the atmosphere of the room. He asked the team to isolate the shipping assumptions used in the projections and to display the raw data behind the freight timing estimates. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before pulling up the spreadsheet that supported the plan. Columns of numbers filled the screen, rows of seasonal shipping volumes stretching across the Midwest distribution network. For most of the executives, the data appeared ordinary, the kind of operational detail that rarely attracted attention once a strategy had already been approved. But William's eyes moved slowly across the columns until they paused on one section near the bottom of the table. He pointed toward a small line of data representing winter freight delays recorded during the previous 2 years. The numbers were higher than the assumptions used in the expansion model. Not dramatically higher at first glance, but enough to cause concern if the pattern repeated during the coming season. The room grew quieter as several managers leaned forward to examine the screen more closely. One of the analysts began recalculating the delay projections, while another searched for archived shipping reports from regional carriers. Within a few minutes, the confident atmosphere of the meeting had faded into careful discussion. Someone suggested that the freight bottleneck near Chicago could indeed create a chain reaction across the Midwest distribution routes if the company expanded too quickly. Another manager mentioned that trucking companies often prioritized established clients during peak winter congestion, which meant Castellano Holdings could face unexpected scheduling delays during the busiest weeks of the year. Daniel Price shifted uncomfortably in his chair as the conversation turned toward the risks hidden inside the plan he had presented with such certainty earlier that morning. William Castellano remained silent while the analysts reviewed the data again. His attention drifted briefly to the window where the skyline stretched across the horizon under a pale winter sun. The rain from the night before had washed the air clean, leaving the buildings sharp against the sky. In his mind, he heard again the quiet voice of the young woman who had spoken in the conference room with surprising confidence despite standing there in a cleaning uniform. She had not spoken with anger or arrogance. She had simply pointed out a flaw. William returned his attention to the table as the analysts finished their calculations. The updated model now projected a substantial financial risk if the company expanded exactly as planned. The numbers on the screen no longer looked like a promise of growth. They looked like a warning. William Castellano folded his hands calmly on the table and spoke in the same measured tone that had built his reputation throughout the industry. He instructed the team to suspend the expansion plan until a full review could be completed. Around the room, several executives exchanged uncertain glances. Daniel Price forced a polite nod while quietly closing the presentation on his laptop. None of them mentioned the cleaner who had raised the same concern the night before, but William Castellano had not forgotten the look on her face as the rain fell outside the glass doors. The meeting ended quietly after the expansion plan was suspended, the executives leaving the conference room with slower steps than usual, as if the polished floor beneath them had suddenly become uncertain ground. Daniel Price gathered his laptop and presentation notes with controlled movements, but the confidence he carried into the meeting had clearly dimmed. A strategy he had presented as flawless now sat under investigation, its numbers exposed to questions that had not existed 24 hours earlier. William Castellano remained seated at the table long after the others had left, the skyline of Manhattan stretching wide beyond the tall windows behind him. The winter sunlight reflected across the glass towers outside, turning the city into a bright grid of steel and mirrored light. Yet his attention was not on the view. His thoughts returned again to the quiet moment from the previous night, when a cleaner had stood beside that same conference table, holding a cloth, and speaking with calm certainty about a flaw no one else had noticed. The words replayed in his memory with surprising clarity. She had not sounded nervous. She had sounded analytical. William had spent decades building companies, negotiating deals, and watching talented people reveal themselves through small moments others ignored. The difference between noise and insight often arrived in a single sentence. He reached for the phone on the table and made a brief call to the company's internal security office. His voice remained calm and precise as he asked for the security footage from the 32nd floor corridor recorded during the previous evening. Within minutes, a file appeared on his laptop. The video showed the quiet hallway outside the conference room, the polished floor reflecting the bright overhead lights as the door opened, and two security guards escorted a young woman toward the elevators. She walked without arguing, her posture straight despite the awkwardness of the moment, holding a canvas bag against her side. William paused the video and looked closely at her face. Maya Johnson. The name appeared in the employee file that arrived shortly after when the Human Resources Department responded to his request for information. The file was surprisingly thin. Temporary overnight cleaning staff. 3 months of employment. No disciplinary reports. No prior corporate experience listed in the official record. But one detail caught his attention immediately. Education history listed but incomplete. Columbia Business School. Program status withdrawn. William leaned back in his chair and studied the document again. That single line explained far more than the entire presentation Daniel Price had delivered earlier that morning. The cleaner who had spoken in the conference room had not been guessing. She had recognized a pattern. Someone with training in corporate finance would have seen the freight delay risk immediately. William closed the file and stood slowly from the table. The rain from the night before had dried from the streets below, but in his mind he still saw the image of Maya Johnson standing alone under the streetlight outside the glass doors while taxis rushed past in the wet Manhattan traffic. Most people in this city would never notice someone in a cleaning uniform walking through a lobby late at night. Invisible work often produced invisible people. But William Castellano had built his entire career by paying attention to the details that others ignored. And the quiet woman who had spoken one precise sentence in the middle of a boardroom full of executives had just prevented a decision that might have cost his company hundreds of millions of dollars. He closed his laptop and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Somewhere beyond the maze of streets below, Maya Johnson had already begun another day in a city that had forgotten her presence inside Castellano Holdings. But William Castellano had not forgotten. The city moved forward as it always did, fast and indifferent, swallowing yesterday's stories beneath the rhythm of subway doors and morning traffic. 3 days after the meeting, the investigation inside Castellano Holdings continued quietly behind closed doors while spreadsheets and shipping data were examined in detail. Analysts recalculated freight schedules, Managers contacted distribution partners across the Midwest, and every new report confirmed the same uncomfortable conclusion. The expansion strategy had indeed overlooked a critical seasonal bottleneck. If the company had launched the plan without adjustment, thousands of shipments could have been delayed during the winter freight surge, triggering penalties, lost contracts, and a cascade of logistical problems across several states. The estimated financial exposure approached $200 million. The realization settled over the executive offices like a slow fog. Daniel Price tried to maintain his authority as the review continued, but the tone in meetings had shifted. Questions were sharper. Conversations were more cautious. Confidence had been replaced by careful analysis. Meanwhile, life outside the glass towers continued without pause. On the Lower East Side, Maya Johnson stepped off a city bus just after 7 in the morning and joined the steady flow of pedestrians moving along the sidewalk. The rain from earlier in the week had disappeared, replaced by clear winter air that carried the faint smell of roasted coffee from a nearby cafe. She walked with the same quiet focus she had learned during years of balancing multiple jobs across Manhattan. After losing her overnight cleaning position, she had returned to the routine that had supported her before Castellano Holdings ever appeared on her schedule. Morning shifts at a neighborhood grocery store stocking shelves before customers arrived. Afternoon hours tutoring 2 high school students in algebra and economics. Evening shifts helping an elderly woman organize paperwork in a small accounting office. None of the jobs paid very much, but together they created enough stability to cover rent on the tiny studio apartment she called home. Maya rarely complained about the schedule. Hard work had never frightened her. What lingered in her mind, however, was not the humiliation of that rainy night. It was the unfinished thought she had carried with her since leaving the conference room. The expansion plan she had seen on the screen still bothered her. During quiet moments between tasks, she found herself replaying the numbers again, mentally adjusting freight routes and recalculating distribution capacity. Sometimes she scribbled notes in the small notebook she carried in her bag, drawing arrows between warehouses and transportation hubs as if solving a puzzle no one else could see. She did not know that several miles away, inside a quiet office overlooking Midtown Manhattan, William Castellano was reviewing the same puzzle from a different perspective. The new reports arriving on his desk continued to confirm that the cleaner who had spoken one careful sentence had been correct. That realization created a different kind of question in his mind. Companies often hired consultants, analysts, and advisors to identify risks before they became disasters. Yet the most valuable insight in this case had come from someone who had been invisible to the entire building. William stood near the tall window of his office as afternoon sunlight stretched across the skyline. Below him, traffic moved through the avenues like steady streams of metal and glass. Somewhere in that vast city, Maya Johnson continued her ordinary routine, unaware that the quiet observation she had offered in a single moment had already changed the direction of a company worth billions of dollars. Winter settled deeper over Manhattan as the weeks moved forward, the wind cutting through the avenues and rattling the bare branches of trees along the sidewalks. Inside Castellano Holdings, the investigation into the expansion strategy finally reached its conclusion. The analysts confirmed what William Castellano had already suspected. The Midwest expansion would have collapsed under the weight of freight congestion, delayed shipments, and contractual penalties if the company had followed the original timeline. The decision to pause the plan had quietly protected hundreds of millions of dollars in future revenue. Yet the origin of that realization remained absent from every official report. No one mentioned the cleaner who had recognized the problem first. In corporate environments, ideas were often attributed to titles rather than insight. Still, William Castellano continued thinking about that brief moment when a quiet voice had interrupted a room full of executives. Insight rarely came from the loudest person in the room. More often it came from someone who had been paying attention while everyone else was performing confidence. One evening after the offices had emptied and the city lights flickered on across the skyline, William sat alone at his desk reviewing the personnel file once again. The information was limited, but it told a story between the lines. Maya Johnson had entered Columbia Business School with strong academic results before withdrawing from the program 2 years later. Her academic records showed advanced coursework in corporate finance, logistics analysis, and strategic management. The transcripts suggested a mind that understood complex systems quickly. William leaned back in his chair and studied the city through the tall window beside his desk. In business, talent was one of the rare resources that could not be manufactured. It had to be discovered. The problem was that talent often appeared in places where powerful institutions refused to look. Somewhere across Manhattan, Maya Johnson continued her routine of small jobs and long hours, unaware that her brief observation inside a conference room had already altered the future of a major company. That thought lingered with William longer than he expected. The following morning, he made a decision that surprised several people inside the organization. Instead of simply adjusting the logistics plan, he authorized the creation of a new strategic analysis unit within Castellano Holdings. The department would focus entirely on identifying hidden operational risks across the company's supply networks. The initiative required analysts who could see patterns others overlooked, people who understood the mathematics behind distribution systems rather than simply trusting optimistic projections. As the planning for the new unit began, William quietly instructed the human resources director to search again for Maya Johnson's contact information. The request confused the staff member at first because her employment record listed only a temporary cleaning contract that had already ended. But William repeated the request with calm certainty. Somewhere in the city, the woman who had prevented a costly mistake was living an ordinary life while executives debated strategies in rooms she once cleaned after midnight. William Castellano believed that kind of oversight revealed more about a company than any balance sheet ever could. Outside the office window, the evening sky turned a deep shade of blue while the first lights appeared across the buildings of Midtown Manhattan. The city looked endless from that height, a grid of streets filled with millions of people moving through their own stories. Somewhere within that vast network of lives, Maya Johnson continued walking forward, unaware that a quiet decision made in a glass tower had just begun to change the direction of her future. The search for Maya Johnson took longer than anyone inside Castellano Holdings expected. The Human Resources Department began with the limited information stored in the temporary employment file, which listed only a phone number and a mailing address connected to the cleaning contractor that had originally assigned her to the building. When the company contacted the contractor, they discovered that Maya had not taken another assignment through their agency since the night she left the office tower in the rain. Temporary workers often moved quietly between jobs across the city, leaving very little trace in formal employment records. For most corporations, that detail would have ended the search immediately. But William Castellano was not interested in convenience. He had built an entire career around pursuing the answers that others considered unnecessary. While the search continued, Maya Johnson moved through her routine without any awareness that a quiet investigation was unfolding miles away. Each morning she arrived at the neighborhood grocery store before sunrise, helping stock the refrigerated shelves while delivery trucks unloaded fresh produce in the narrow alley behind the building. The work required steady hands and patience rather than ambition, but Maya performed each task with the same quiet discipline she had once applied to financial models and classroom discussions. When the morning shift ended, she walked 10 blocks to a small tutoring center where she helped 2 high school students prepare for their college entrance exams. Mathematics and economics came easily to her, and the students often joked that she could solve equations faster than the calculator on their phones. Maya never explained how natural those calculations felt because numbers had always made sense to her in a way the rest of the world sometimes did not. In the evenings, she worked inside a modest accounting office where stacks of invoices and receipts filled narrow metal filing cabinets along the walls. The owner of the firm, an elderly man named Leonard Brooks, often watched Maya organize the documents with quiet admiration. He once asked why someone with such strong analytical skills had not pursued a career in finance or consulting. Maya simply smiled and said that life had taken her in a different direction. Leonard did not press further. People in New York understood that every person carried a story that did not always fit neatly on a resume. Meanwhile, the search inside Castellano Holdings finally produced a small breakthrough. One of the analysts reviewing Maya's old university records discovered that her student profile still listed a secondary email address used during her final semester at Columbia Business School. The address had not been updated in several years, but it was the first direct contact information anyone had located since the night she left the building. When the message was finally sent, it contained only a short and carefully worded request asking Maya Johnson to contact the office of William Castellano regarding a professional opportunity. The email traveled quietly through the network of servers and cables that connected the city, passing unnoticed through the endless digital traffic of Manhattan. Hours later, while sitting at the small desk in her studio apartment reviewing notes from a tutoring session, Maya heard the soft notification sound from her aging laptop. She glanced at the screen, expecting another reminder from the tutoring center or a utility bill alert. Instead, she saw the name Castellano Holdings glowing in the subject line. For several seconds, she simply stared at the message, uncertain whether it was real or some strange coincidence. Outside her window, the evening traffic moved steadily through the street below, the distant sound of car horns drifting upward into the quiet room. Maya slowly opened the email and began to read. Maya Johnson read the message 3 times before she believed it was real. The email was brief and formal, written in the precise tone corporations used when every word had been carefully chosen. Castellano Holdings requested that she contact the executive office regarding a potential professional discussion. There was no explanation, no description of the opportunity, and no hint about why a company that had escorted her out of its building weeks earlier would suddenly want to hear from her again. For a moment, Maya simply sat at the small wooden desk in her apartment, the faint hum of traffic outside drifting through the slightly open window. Her studio apartment was barely 300 square feet, a narrow space that held a bed against one wall, a second-hand desk beneath the window, and a tiny kitchenette along the opposite side. The room smelled faintly of brewed coffee and the stack of textbooks she had slowly begun collecting again from used bookstores across the city. She had never truly stopped studying. Even after leaving Columbia Business School, she continued reading about logistics systems, market analysis, and supply chain mathematics whenever she found spare hours late at night. The email on her screen felt like an echo from a life she had placed carefully behind her. Maya leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for several seconds, remembering the cold rain that had soaked through her uniform the night security escorted her out of the glass tower. The humiliation had faded with time, but the memory remained sharp. She remembered the quiet confidence with which she had spoken in the conference room and the laughter that followed. Most people would have deleted the message immediately. Returning to that building meant reopening a door she had already closed. Yet curiosity tugged at her thoughts. Castellano Holdings had not contacted her by accident. Large companies did not search for former temporary employees unless there was a reason. Maya turned back to the laptop and reread the message slowly. The sender's name belonged to an executive assistant in the office of William Castellano himself. That detail made her pause. Even someone who had only cleaned conference rooms at night knew the significance of that name. William Castellano was the founder of the company and the architect behind its rise into one of the most powerful logistics corporations in the country. People inside the building spoke about him with a mixture of admiration and quiet caution. Maya rested her fingers on the edge of the keyboard while she considered the possibilities. Perhaps the email was about the comment she had made in the conference room. Perhaps the company had finally reviewed the expansion strategy and realized there had been a mistake. Or perhaps they simply wanted to question her about something unrelated. She exhaled slowly and closed the laptop halfway, staring at the narrow strip of city lights visible through the window. Outside, Manhattan continued its endless movement of headlights and distant sirens, the city never slowing long enough to notice the decisions unfolding inside small apartments like hers. After a few minutes, Maya reopened the laptop and typed a short reply thanking the sender for reaching out and asking for more information about the meeting they wanted to schedule. She hesitated before pressing send, then finally clicked the key. The email disappeared from her screen and traveled back through the network of cables beneath the city streets. Somewhere inside a tall glass building in Midtown Manhattan, a quiet conversation was about to begin that would change far more than Maya Johnson expected. The reply from Castellano Holdings arrived the following morning while Maya Johnson was standing behind the narrow counter of the grocery store where she worked the early shift. The store had just opened and the first customers were slowly moving through the aisles with quiet determination, picking up milk cartons, fresh bread, and the small necessities that filled ordinary mornings in New York City. Maya's phone vibrated softly in the pocket of her jacket, and when she glanced at the screen, she immediately recognized the sender's name. For a brief moment, she hesitated before opening the message. The email confirmed that William Castellano's office would like to meet with her in person at the company's headquarters later that week. The message included a specific time, a visitor pass authorization, and a simple note that transportation costs would be covered if necessary. The tone remained professional and respectful. Without a single word referring to the night, she had been escorted out of the building. Maya slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued organizing the shelves while her thoughts began to move quickly. The idea of walking back into the same building where security had once guided her out into the rain felt strange, almost unreal. Yet something about the message suggested that the conversation ahead would not be about apologies or explanations. Castellano Holdings was a company that operated with deliberate purpose. If the founder himself had asked to speak with her, the reason had to involve more than a simple misunderstanding. 2 days later, Maya stood on the corner of 42nd Street as morning traffic streamed through Midtown Manhattan. The towering glass building of Castellano Holdings rose above the surrounding skyline exactly as she remembered it, reflecting the bright winter sunlight across its polished exterior. People in tailored coats and polished shoes moved in and out of the lobby with the steady confidence of professionals beginning their day. Maya paused for a moment before crossing the street, adjusting the collar of the dark blue coat she had borrowed from a friend for the meeting. She had chosen simple professional clothing that felt comfortable rather than impressive. Confidence, she believed, did not come from expensive fabric. It came from knowing the numbers behind a decision. Inside the building, the marble lobby looked exactly as it had during her overnight cleaning shifts months earlier, though now the space was filled with daylight and the quiet murmur of morning conversations. The receptionist greeted her politely and handed her a visitor badge after confirming her name on the schedule. None of the employees passing through the lobby recognized her as the cleaner who once worked the night shift. In a city like New York, faces moved through buildings constantly, appearing and disappearing without leaving much memory behind. The elevator ride to the executive floors lasted less than a minute, yet it felt longer as Maya watched the illuminated numbers rise above the door. When the elevator opened, a quiet hallway stretched toward a set of glass doors marked with the discreet lettering of the executive offices. An assistant greeted her and guided her toward a spacious conference room with tall windows overlooking the city skyline. The room was calm and bright, filled with natural light that reflected off a polished wooden table at the center. Maya took a seat and looked out across Manhattan while the distant traffic hummed far below the windows. A few moments later, the door opened gently, and William Castellano stepped inside the room for the first time since the night he had watched her disappear into the rain. William Castellano entered the room with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to decisions that carried enormous weight. He closed the glass door gently behind him and walked toward the table with an unhurried pace, his expression calm and attentive rather than intimidating. Up close, he appeared slightly older than Maya remembered from the brief glimpses she had seen during her overnight shifts in the building. But there was also a steady clarity in his presence that made people naturally listen when he spoke. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The sunlight from the tall windows stretched across the polished table between them, reflecting faintly against the skyline of Manhattan behind Maya's chair. Finally, William took a seat across from her and folded his hands calmly on the table. He thanked her for coming in and apologized for the short notice of the meeting. His voice was measured and thoughtful, the tone of someone who chose his words carefully rather than filling silence with unnecessary conversation. Maya nodded politely and returned the greeting, though she remained unsure what direction the conversation would take. William studied her for a moment, not with suspicion but with quiet curiosity. Then he asked a question that surprised her slightly. He asked how she had recognized the flaw in the Midwest expansion plan so quickly. Maya paused before answering. She had expected the meeting to involve an explanation about her removal from the building, or perhaps a simple acknowledgement of the comment she made that night. Instead, the founder of the company was asking about her reasoning. She explained calmly that the logistics projections she saw on the presentation screen did not account for seasonal freight congestion in the Chicago distribution corridor. During winter months, shipping companies often experience delays due to limited highway access, severe weather conditions, and scheduling conflicts with established freight contracts. When those delays occurred, they created a backlog that could ripple through warehouse inventories across multiple states. Maya spoke carefully, describing how the distribution network would struggle to recover once the delays began to stack together across several weeks. William listened without interrupting while she explained the chain reaction step by step. His attention focused on the clarity of her analysis rather than the circumstances that had placed her in the conference room that evening. When she finished speaking, the room fell quiet again for a few seconds. William nodded slowly and confirmed that the company's analysts had discovered the same flaw during their review. The mistake had been serious enough to threaten the stability of the expansion project. Maya looked briefly out the window toward the city skyline, absorbing the weight of what he had just said. For months, she had assumed that her comment had simply been ignored. Instead, the company had paused a major decision because of it. William leaned slightly forward and asked another question that revealed the real purpose of the meeting. He asked why someone with such strong analytical ability was working overnight cleaning shifts instead of pursuing a career in strategic finance. Maya hesitated again, then explained quietly that she had once been enrolled in Columbia Business School, but withdrew when her mother's medical treatment created expenses she could not ignore. Tuition, rent, and hospital bills had forced her to choose stability over education. William listened carefully while she spoke, his expression thoughtful rather than sympathetic. When she finished, he nodded once more and leaned back in his chair, the skyline of Manhattan stretching wide behind him. Then he said something that Maya had not expected to hear when she walked into the building that morning. He told her that Castellano Holdings had recently created a new strategic analysis division and that he believed someone with her ability to recognize hidden operational risks might belong in that room instead of cleaning it after midnight. For several seconds, Maya Johnson did not respond. The offer hung in the quiet air of the conference room while the sunlight from the tall windows stretched across the polished table between them. Outside, Midtown Manhattan continued moving with its usual rhythm of traffic and distant construction noise. But inside the room, everything felt unusually still. Maya had walked into the building expecting a short conversation and perhaps a formal acknowledgement of the comment she made weeks earlier. She had not expected an opportunity that could change the direction of her entire life. She looked at William Castellano carefully, searching his expression for any sign that the proposal might be symbolic rather than real. But his posture remained calm and direct, the steady composure of someone who did not make casual decisions. He explained that the new strategic analysis division was designed to identify risks before they developed into major operational problems. The department would review logistics models, supply chain projections, and expansion strategies across every region where the company operated. It required analysts who could notice patterns others overlooked, people who understood that numbers were not simply data points, but signals of future consequences. Maya listened quietly while he described the structure of the new team. Her mind moved quickly through the information, instinctively analyzing the systems he mentioned. Strategic forecasting, freight modeling, distribution risk assessment. These were subjects she had studied for years, even after leaving the university program she once believed would define her career. For a long moment, she said nothing, considering the reality of the moment sitting in front of her. She thought about the small apartment where she spent her evenings tutoring students and reviewing financial textbooks late into the night. She thought about the grocery store where she stocked shelves before sunrise. She thought about the conference room she once cleaned after midnight while executives debated decisions that shaped the future of a company she was never meant to influence. Finally, she spoke with the same calm clarity that had surprised the executives weeks earlier. She told William that she had not finished her graduate degree and that she did not carry the traditional credentials most companies expected from analysts in strategic roles. William listened without interrupting, then responded with a quiet certainty that surprised her again. He said that credentials could describe where someone had studied, but they did not always describe how someone thought. What mattered to him was the moment when she had recognized a structural flaw in a complex logistics plan faster than an entire room of experienced managers. That moment had revealed something far more valuable than a line on a resume. Maya looked down at the table for a brief second as the weight of his words settled in. For months, she had believed that speaking in that conference room had been a mistake that cost her a job. Instead, it had revealed a path she had never expected. William then explained that the position would begin with a 6-month evaluation period working directly with the new strategy team. During that time, she would participate in logistics modeling projects and assist in reviewing operational risks across several distribution networks. If her analysis proved as strong as he believed, the role would become permanent. The offer was direct and serious. Maya lifted her eyes again and looked across the table toward the skyline behind him. The same city that had pushed her into survival work was now offering a door she once believed had closed forever. After a long, quiet breath, she nodded slowly, understanding that the moment unfolding inside that bright conference room was the beginning of a completely different future. The decision did not change the city outside the windows, but for Maya Johnson the world had quietly shifted. The following weeks unfolded with a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and strangely natural. Each morning she walked through the glass doors of Castellano Holdings not as someone who cleaned the conference rooms after midnight, but as part of the team sitting at the table while decisions were made. The building itself had not changed. The marble floors still reflected the bright lobby lights, and the elevators still moved silently. Toward the upper floors where the executive offices overlooked the endless grid of Manhattan streets. Yet everything felt different because Maya was now walking through the same hallways with a purpose that had once seemed impossible. Her first weeks in the Strategic Analysis Division were filled with long hours studying supply chain models and reviewing distribution reports from across the country. Freight volumes from Illinois, warehouse capacities in Ohio, rail transport schedules in Pennsylvania. The data arrived in complex layers of spreadsheets and forecasts, but Maya approached each problem with the same quiet focus that once helped her recognize a flaw in a presentation she was never meant to see. The analysts working beside her quickly realized that she possessed a rare instinct for patterns hidden inside complicated systems. While others concentrated on quarterly projections, Maya often noticed the subtle connections between seasonal freight delays, warehouse storage limits, and shifting transportation contracts. Small details that appeared harmless alone often revealed larger risks when combined together. Within 3 months, she presented a logistics model that identified a vulnerability in one of the company's southern distribution routes, a potential delay chain that could have disrupted shipments across 4 states during hurricane season. The strategy team adjusted the schedule before the problem ever appeared. The solution saved the company millions of dollars in emergency rerouting costs. Word of her work spread quietly through the executive offices. Some managers were surprised to learn that the analyst producing such precise models had once cleaned the same conference rooms where they held meetings. Others simply recognized that talent had appeared where they had never thought to look. One afternoon near the end of her 6th month at the company, Maya stood near the tall windows of the strategy department overlooking the wide Manhattan skyline. The late afternoon sun turned the glass towers across the city into bright reflections of gold and steel. Behind her, analysts continued discussing transportation routes and seasonal supply forecasts. In many ways the moment felt ordinary, yet Maya knew how unlikely it truly was. Months earlier she had stood outside this same building in the rain, believing that speaking honestly had closed the door to a future she once dreamed about. Now she was helping guide decisions that shaped the direction of the entire company. Later that evening, William Castellano paused briefly outside the strategy office as he walked through the hallway. Through the glass wall, he could see Maya studying a set of freight projections on the large digital screen while several analysts listened to her explanation. He did not interrupt. He simply watched for a moment before continuing down the corridor. The city outside the windows remained as vast and unpredictable as ever, filled with millions of people moving through their own stories. Yet somewhere inside that endless movement, one quiet observation spoken on a rainy night had changed the course of more than one life.